BBC4 Collections, specially chosen programmes from the BBC archive. This collection traces the BBC's first steps into archaeology programming. More programmes on this theme and other BBC4 collections are available on BBC iPlayer.
Sir Mortimer Wheeler dug the huge Iron Age hill fort of Stanwick in northern Yorkshire in 1951 as his contribution to the Festival of Britain. As it turned out, it was his last major excavation in Britain, but he brought to it the same originality that had marked all his digs, the same unerring gift for making the past come alive.
The people we dug up were living at the beginning of what we call the Roman period, let's say in the years immediately following the Roman invasion of this country in 43 AD. We know that from the pieces of pottery that we began to find in our digging already, quite early on. We knew also that involved in this affair were the local natives, we call them Celts, but they were the local natives, to one of the chieftains amongst whom this sword I've told you of must have belonged.
But these were in fact the British.
They were the British. The Brigantes were the Yorkshiremen of the period, roughly speaking. The great tribe which stretched, as we're told, from sea to sea across what is now roughly Yorkshire and Lancashire, cutting the whole island into half. The Brigantes occupied that area, the area in the midst of which we were digging. It was a pastoral society. It lived not on corn, but on beef and milk and things of that sort. Secondly, by way of contrast to this, the southern part of the island was agricultural. We had an agricultural south and a pastoral north. The island was divided roughly into two. And all this happened in the pastoral north, amongst the Brigantes. First thing they did, on arriving here in 43 AD with the Romans, was to exploit the south, where the corn grew. You see, the Roman soldiers in those days didn't eat much meat. They ate gruel and oats and barley and so on. They were vegetarians very largely, and they wanted to develop the vegetarian area of England at first, and they did. Places like Maiden Castle. So. Meanwhile, in order to keep the rest of the island quiet, they came to some sort of an agreement with the Brigantes in the north, whereby the Brigantes held their fire.
I remember Tacitus said somewhere that the Romans thought that the men of Kent were the only civilized people that they knew, presumably because they ate porridge.
Well, partly that, but partly also, of course, they were nearer to the Roman world. They had been in contact with the Roman world up to a point, and they traded with Gaul, which was already Roman, and so they had a better opportunity of advancement than the people in the far north, in the hills and moors of the north.
The uncouth Yorkshiremen.
The uncouth Yorkshiremen. I won't go further north than that at the moment.
These Brigantes, were they the sort of equivalent of the kind of partisans that you got in the Second World War? They were guerrillas who took to the mountains and carried on attacking the invaders from these mountain fastnesses.
It's more this way, I think, Mag, that having made this compact with the Romans, they proceeded at the first opportunity to break it. When the Romans began to march across Wales with their eyes on Ireland, the Romans never got to Ireland, But they obviously intended to at one time. They were marching towards Anglesey in Ireland. And when they got far enough away from the main part of England, of what is now England, the Brigantes, this northern tribe, rose behind them. They had to therefore turn round and go back and bring them to heel again, bring them to heel. And this state of affairs of come and go, as it were, continued for the next generation. The Brigantes had a royal house with King Venutius and Queen Cartimandua. Queen Cartimandua had handed over Caratacus to the Romans when he took refuge with her.
Is this the Caractacus of the pop song?
It's correct, Caractacus to the, say, the vulgar. But Caratacus, after all, if you can say Boudicca, I can say Caratacus. Now, she, Cartimandua, the queen, became pro-Roman. She was a Quisley. The king, this is around about the middle of the first century, the king was anti-Roman, and with him went the major part of his tribe. His little original hill fort was enlarged, first of all, by the addition of 130 acres of new ground, which included a stream, now known as the Mary Wild Beck. I don't know who Mary Wild was, nobody could tell me. But a large part of her stream was included in the new defenses, so that his allies, whom he began to call into his aid, could bring their flocks and herds with them. And then later, round about, shall we say, 69, 70 A.D., so we're getting on gradually into the century, Venutius further enlarged this great place by the addition of 400 acres more, 600 acres more.
Why?
Because he was calling in more tribesmen. He called in the neighboring tribes to his aid. They all flocked into his colors, as it were, bringing their food with them, bringing their flocks and herds and their families with them, in that order. And they wanted space. They wanted more and more of this stream to water their flocks at for their own purposes. And so the place grew to the enormous size that it is today. But we found, in digging this final enlargement, that the work had never been finished. It was stopped in the middle. The great entrance at the south, which I thought might produce more swords and more relics, was found never to have been used. The rocks were lying loose, the great rocks which they chiseled away in making their rock-cut ditch there, were still lying loose where the builders had left them.
So, in fact, the Romans had cottoned on to what Venutius was doing and attacked before he had time to get it all ready.
Yes, but at this time, the Romans had an advanced legion at York. Their 9th Legion, the famous 9th Legion. The 9th Legion always lost its battles, except the last one. And the last one is the one I'm just coming to, when, about 70 A.D., just after 70, the Brigantes rose for the last time under their king. The queen had fled to the Romans for safety. But the Brigantes rose under their king, and you can almost hear the 9th Legion tramping up the road when you look at this unfinished entrance with the rocks still standing there as the builders had left them. It's very vivid indeed.
Now, there was another bit that you yourself added to the report of this excavation. I remember reading in one of the footnotes, and in that you describe a little bit what you thought about Queen Cartimandua. You said that you thought, in fact, that she was a southern princess who had been living in a land of wine and honey, and then she'd been married off to some uncouth cattle rancher from the north, from Yorkshire, and that she resented this the whole time. They were a totally incompatible couple, and that this perhaps is why they fell out.
That's it, you've got it perfect. Well,
Yes. And she couldn't take these ranchers of the north.
I think you're perfectly right. I was perfectly right too when I wrote that footnote, I think, that Cartimandua almost certainly was a member of Cymbeline or Canobelin's family, came from the neighborhood of Colchester, the most civilized part of pre-Roman Britain, and that she became a quisling for that reason, that her sympathies were with her relations in the south, and she couldn't stand this hairy
husband.
Well, husband is yes, or this hairy husband, this what should I say, pastoral shepherd, this great shepherd in the north. He's more than a shepherd, because we know that he had not only sheep and goats, but he had masses of cattle. We found their remains, you see, the remains of their dinners and the dinners of his fellow tribesmen. We found them all there. We've got the whole evidence.
Now, you call her a quisling queen, but presumably there wasn't the same kind of sense of nationalism during the Roman invasion that you had, for instance, in the Second World War. Because after all, it wasn't a nation, it was just a series of scattered tribes that occupied large areas of England.
I think it's perfectly clear from one's reading of what is left of Tacitus that the anti-Roman feeling and the patriotic, local, tribal anti-Roman feeling were very strongly marked.
I've always been fascinated by the way in which, during your excavations, you've come across the spoor of great men of the past, men like Caesar, Vespasian in his attack on Maiden Castle, and in Pakistan, Alexander the Great at Charsadda. What do you feel about these people whom you were helping to dig up?
Well, you can't dig for them unless you begin to know them. You can't follow them unless you have a sort of idea of what they're going after themselves. No, but the point is this. I have a bias. We all have a bias in one direction or another. But my bias is in favor of the individual. I like to know the individual. There are those, and they're very good archaeologists, who are content to know all that there is to know about a collection of flint implements, anonymous flint implements. Very important. It gives you some idea of social values at a certain period, or at a conjectural period, if you like, sometimes. But I've always had, and this probably goes back to my classical beginnings, when after all you were dealing with individual writers, individual poets, Horace and Livy and Tacitus and so on. They were all individuals. And as writers, they were individuals, and they were themselves interested in individuals. And that's probably why I have this little bias myself for what is called history and proto-history. The phases of man, a man's story, a man's history, when you can pick out here and there a few odd individuals who have contributed, more than others perhaps, to progress, what we call progress, or what they may have called progress, and so on. Well, more recently, I've, in a small way, been treading in the footsteps of Alexander at Charsadda, in the northwest frontier. You go up to the northwest frontier today, do you know? There is in the atmosphere of the northwest frontier a certain sense of open air. Things may happen. An army may go by almost invisibly, but you can sense it. You find the actual landscape through which Alexander, in his various moods, galloped, was wounded, conquered, and never quite failed. Very nearly, once or twice, but never quite failed. He's a success story, but a success which he deserves. And to follow a man of that kind, of that caliber, through the landscape, which we know he penetrated, to dig up an ancient city like Pushkalavati, Lotus City, which we know that he conquered himself with an enormous force, where he himself went and received the surrender of the inhabitants, and where he put his own garrison in, and so on. A success story, but a success story on an immense field. So you don't get lost in the personality. The personality is always a figure in a wider landscape. That's me.